I don't think the most effective way to help a pre-med get into medical school and become the kind of doctor that they dream to be is to rely on anecdotes and gut feelings and going with your heart. All right, pre-meds, we got to talk about two big things. I'm going to show you some official data that you can access yourself from official sources, and how I think the misinterpretation or the lying about this data on the internet, on social media at large, because of some well-intentioned but very misguided efforts, is actually causing confusion and harming a lot of pre-med. So I want to make sure you're not making those mistakes. So the first thing is you can go to specialtyrank.com. And I've created this free tool because some of you may know back in 2017, 2018, I created the Med School Insider's Specialty Competitiveness Index. And that is a data-backed way where we gather all the official data from the NRMP and help you understand how competitive each and every specialty is. And bear with me, this is going to relate to your med school choice in a second. Essentially, it's gone through a few evolutions. At the very beginning, we had step 1, step 2, match rate, number of research items, AOA status, and percentage of students who come from a top 40 NIH-funded school. And we weighted each of those 6 factors evenly. Then in future versions, we iterated on that. Of course, top 40 NIH is not as reliable of how competitive a specialty is versus something like step 1, step 2, research items, etc. So we've changed the weighting since. And now, rather than having to go to a clunky Google sheet and then messing with the data there, you can actually manipulate it yourself on specialtyrank.com. You can see all the official data from the NRMP going back to 2014 all the way up to the most recent data, which is currently 2024. And you can then customize the weighting yourself. So you can change step 2 up or down depending on what you think is more or less important, because a few people were very skeptical of the initial results. Since I, of course, went into plastic surgery residency, some people accused me of manipulating the data and creating an algorithm that just put plastic surgery at number 1, which was obviously not the case. But you can always customize the data yourself for each of the years, and we're very proud of this tool. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is actually this new feature that I just added yesterday. At the top left here, you can actually select match rates for not just MD, which is the default, but now I've also added support for both DO and IMG. And these are match rates from, again, official sources. And what you'll note is that right now in 2024, the match rate for every single specialty, except for one, is highest for US MD students, and it is lower for DOs and also lower for IMGs or FMGs. The only one exception is vascular surgery, which is 88.5% for MDs, 88.9% for DO. And no, I don't think that if you want to go into vascular surgery, you should go DO, because that's just a small amount of noise. Vascular surgery, very small program, smaller sample size. So I would actually bet that that is not statistically significant. But you can go through all of this data yourself, and I urge you to do so, and go through all the different years as well. Go back 2022, 2020, and so on. And you'll note the same thing, which is that the highest match rate is MD, every single time except for that one instance of vascular surgery in 2024. And then DO is going to be lower, as well as IMG, FMG. And the reason this is important is that there is a lot of misinformation out there that DO and MD are the same. It doesn't matter. I've covered the actual significant drawbacks of going DO in previous videos, both on this channel as well as on Med School Insiders. And I urge you to watch those if you want to see what the other downsides are beyond just match rate into whatever specialty. But in this video, I want to focus on just hard data. And the data show that DO and IMG match rates, which includes, let's say you're considering going to a Caribbean medical school, they're going to be a lot lower for just about every single specialty versus if you went US MD. So keep that in mind. I should also caveat this by saying this is not a comment on how good or bad different types of doctors are, whether they are DO or IMGs, etc. This is just about you getting into your desired specialty when you finish med school. And at Med School Insiders, we very much prioritize relying on data to help guide our decisions when working with students, helping them get into med school, helping them get into residency. And I think everyone would benefit if we were able to talk about facts as just facts without having to lie about the facts or obfuscate the facts and have some other agenda. However, keep in mind, per recent data from the AAMC, about 3/4 of med students change their mind about specialties, meaning when they enter med school, they think they're going to do one thing or they're undecided. And by the time that they graduate med school and actually apply to residency, they do something different than they intended. I was one of those people, wanted to do pediatric gastroenterology, ended up matching into plastic surgery instead. And the second point is we are looking at retrospective data. We're looking at data in the past. This is not some controlled study where we're deciding if the only variable we change is DO versus MD, what actually happens in terms of match rates. That's not what we're doing. There are confounders here, which essentially muddy the relationship between the variable we're looking at, MD versus DO, and also the match rate per specialty. There are other factors that influence those things. So a great way to understand this is with, of course, an example. So you'll see that the rate of drownings is highly correlated to the rate of ice cream consumption. So the more ice cream consumption goes up, we see that the more drownings that occur. And it would be very silly for us to conclude that by eating ice cream, we're causing drownings. That's not what's happening. What's likely happening is the confounding variable of warm summer weather being the single factor, the single variable that is linked to both of those things. So when it is hot, we see ice cream consumption goes up, but also more people are at the pool, and we see a greater rate of drownings. So one of the variables that we do need to be mindful of in this instance is that on average, students that matriculate to DO medical schools instead of MD medical schools, osteopathic versus allopathic medical schools, on average have much lower MCATs and also much lower GPAs. And since prior academic performance is a reliable indicator of future academic performance, and they are quite correlated. In fact, your MCAT score is the single most predictive variable of your USMLE step scores, then you would assume that the DO students are not going to be scoring as strongly on these standardized exams compared to the MD students. Again, we're talking population level, associations, and averages. There are going to be many edge cases of people who do not score very well on the MCAT and absolutely crush USMLE step 1, step 2. Well, not really step 1 because it's pass-fail, but step 2, you know what I mean? And vice versa. People that absolutely crush MCAT, but then really bomb USMLE step 2, or they fail step 1.
I want to illustrate this with a specific example from social media. So on the Med School Insider's Instagram, there's a reel of me talking about how pre-meds should generally choose MD over DO. And we got a comment from Dr. Nate M33. This is really important and a really illustrative comment. I'll show you why. As a DO who matched into dermatology, I can say confidently your education and career are ultimately shaped by your own effort, mentorship, and perseverance, not the letters after your name. It's true DO students face structural challenges. It's important to acknowledge them honestly. But using those challenges to tell pre-meds to avoid DO programs altogether oversimplifies the reality. Many DO graduates match into highly competitive specialties, publish research, take on leadership, and thrive in and out of academic medicine. The more accurate message is this: MD and DO pathways each have advantages and drawbacks. Students should understand the differences, consider where they will be supported and successful, and choose the path that aligns with their goals, not be discouraged by blanket statements. Instead of telling students that one route is inherently inferior, you should continue to help them understand the full picture so they can make informed decisions based on facts, not fear. So I am disappointed by this comment. This is not a personal attack to Dr. Nate, but this exact kind of comment is pervasive across social media, and this is the exact issue I'm talking about. It sounds really good on paper, right? It sounds like, oh, this is very supportive and balanced. But let's actually dissect this piece by piece and how it's actually damaging for pre-meds to hear this. So first of all, yes, your education and career trajectory are shaped by your own efforts and such, not just the letters after your name. I have never said, and I will never say, that if you go DO, you're going to be a bad doctor, and if you go MD, you're going to be a good doctor. Absolutely not. You can be a good or bad doctor regardless of whether you are MD or DO. That is ultimately a personal choice, and it is up to you, the individual. On to the next paragraph. Many DO graduates match into highly competitive specialties every year, etc., etc. True. But that is a very dishonest, misleading, and disappointing statement to read, especially from someone who went to medical school. Because when you go to med school, you're going to understand some basic research and data analysis and conclusions that you can and cannot draw. This statement is incredibly misleading. Because yes, DO graduates do all those things, but do they do it at the same rate as MD students? Well, let's look at one factor, which is match rates. Because Nate matched into dermatology, which is an incredibly competitive specialty and very impressive. And when we go to specialtyrank.com, we can see all of the official NRMP data and look at the match rates. I'm going to select both MD and DO match rates here. And we can see that the DO match rate for dermatology in the most recent year, which is 2024, was 50%. For MDs, it was 71.6%. That's quite a big spread. So yes, DO students are matching into dermatology, but at a much lower rate than those who are MDs. Plastic surgery doesn't even have a published DO match rate from the NRMP because it was so low. I remember the year I matched into plastics, there was one DO student who got in out of 160-ish seats, something like that. That was a big deal. Like, people were talking about it because that one DO student got in. And if you look at other specialties on specialtyrank.com, you'll see that the DO match rate is lower than the MD match rate for just about every single specialty. And you're going to see a larger gap at the more competitive end and a much smaller gap when it comes to primary care specialties. So we call this survivorship bias. And this actually reminds me of when I was at SGU. So there's some videos, some spicy videos of my experience visiting a Caribbean medical school. And while I was there, I actually spoke with a lot of college advisors who were also visiting the school to learn more about going to med school in the Caribbean. And I asked some of these college advisors, how do you decide whether a student should go MD versus DO versus Caribbean? And one of the college advisors told me that they would go to findado.com and then look up the specialty of interest for that pre-med, because remember, this is a pre-med who's deciding to go into med school, whether they want to go MD or DO. So it's a pre-med who says, I want to be a neurosurgeon or an orthopedic surgeon. They go to findado.com and search for that specialty. And if they see DOs who are in that specialty, which by the way is every single specialty, then they tell the student that yes, it is fine for you to go DO. You can totally become this kind of doctor, which is not a false statement. You can absolutely become a dermatologist, orthopedic surgeon, et cetera, if you go DO. But again, that's survivorship bias, right? Because you want to give that pre-med student the maximal odds of success. And saying that, hey, I can see on findado.com that there are DOs in this specialty is clearly not doing so, because you're not disclosing and not even aware that while there are DOs in that specialty, the rate of med students matching into that specialty from DO medical schools is much lower than from MD medical schools. And the other big issue I have with that is that 75% of pre-meds change their mind about their specialty of choice. It's actually med students from their first day of med school to the last day of med school is 75%, which means pre-meds are probably even more than 75% of them who change their mind. Therefore, if you change your mind, like I did, from pediatric gastroenterology, very not competitive, to plastic surgery, number 1 or number 2 most competitive, then obviously it's much better to be in an MD program that gives you the optionality. Going back to Nate's comment, the more accurate message for pre-meds is MD and DO pathways each have advantages and drawbacks. Again, this sounds really good. You're nailing all the talking points, but what's the actual substance there? Let's actually dissect this. So let's talk about the benefits of going DO. So the 2 main benefits are, number 1, you get trained on OMM or OMT. That's osteopathic manipulative treatment or medicine. And it's essentially the one differentiator between the MD and the DO school curriculum, which I would argue is not really a strong draw because the overwhelming majority of DOs in practice never even use it again. Some of it is also not backed by scientific evidence. Looking at you, craniosacral therapy. The second and the main benefit of going DO is just that it's easier to get in. So when you look at the data of matriculants to MD schools, the MCAT and GPA is substantially higher than those to DO schools. That is the main reason why students choose DO over MD. I used to think that a large part of it was this desire for OMM or OMT, but after working now with several thousands of students through Med School Insiders, we help people get into med school. Surprise, surprise, almost every single time, students are choosing DO over MD as a backup option when they cannot get into MD schools. So if those are the 2 benefits of going DO, what are the drawbacks? Most other things, match rates into specialties, student loan burden, quality of clinical rotations, and the list goes on. We cover that in a lot more detail in some separate videos that you can find linked below. And then Nate concludes that you shouldn't tell students that one route is inferior, you should educate them on the pros and cons of each. And I agree, I'm actually all about giving people the full picture. I think what's happening here is that there's a lot of ego involved, right? And there's a lot of defensiveness whenever you talk poorly about a DO program. You're gonna see a lot of people, usually DOs, not always, come out with pitchforks saying, hey, how dare you say that? You can be a great doctor whether you're an MD or a DO. But again, if you are a DO medical student, if you are a DO resident, if you are a DO attending, you can still be an excellent doctor because that is not determined by the degree after your name. But if you are a pre-med, there are so many upsides to going MD and there are so many more downsides by going DO. I got lied to as a pre-med myself about the differences between MD and DO from people like Nate, who want to say that, hey, everything's the same, everything's good, pros and cons, without actually talking about real substance. In fact, I was told, hey, DO is just as good, except you also learn this additional thing. That's incredibly dishonest and damaging to pre-meds. So to Nate and everyone else that makes comments like Nate, please, let's stop lying to pre-meds. Let's keep it real. Let's keep it honest.
This really hits home for me because when I was applying to medical school and no doctors in my family, no one ahead of me to really serve as a mentor and a guiding figure. So I'm trying to figure this out myself and I'm totally lost as a pre-med, as I'm sure many of you can understand, right, what that feels like. Although I will say that nowadays it's so much easier to access that information with YouTube and these various resources that weren't available back then. And back then it was just SDN, the blind leading the blind, you know. But there was a DO doctor who was demonstrating the gait of someone from the audience who, you know, had an asymmetric gait, and then he did some OMM or OMT, that's osteopathic manipulative medicine or osteopathic manipulative treatment. And after doing that for, 2 minutes on a table, he's, doing some OMT. The volunteer walks again, and all of a sudden his gait is a lot more symmetric. And I thought, oh wow, this is really cool. Like, why have I never heard of DO? And should I be considering this? And I'm so grateful that I did not apply to DO medical schools because that would have resulted in downsides I wasn't aware of as a pre-med. So there are 2 points that come up when talking about this. Number 1 is that a lot of people who go to DO medical schools, they oftentimes want to do primary care, which is a valid point. So we're talking population averages. These are trends, just data, right? I'm not talking about individual instances because, as we always say on the Med School Insiders channel, statistics apply to populations, not to individuals. And the second thing I want to discuss is much more sensitive, much more delicate, but what we're covering here in this video is not whether this should or should not be the case. We're talking about what is. We're going to talk about both gender as well as ethnicity when it comes to medical school admissions and how those correlate with both MCAT scores and GPA. And the reason I want to talk about this today is that it actually came up on a conversation between myself and one of our clients at Med School Insiders. We're helping him get into med school. And the advice I gave him was shaped by this data. Because I don't think the most effective way to help a pre-med get into medical school and become the kind of doctor that they dream to be, regardless of what specialty that is to rely on anecdotes and gut feelings and going with your heart. While those things do have their place, I think it is far more important to have a foundation based on hard data. And that's the philosophy that we have at Med School Insiders. And some of the principles there I want to share with you today so that you can actually understand your own realistic chances of getting into med school. So let's start with the MCAT scores and GPAs for both applicants and matriculants based on gender between men and women. Let's first anchor the averages for all matriculants. So the average matriculant MCAT score is a 511.8. And when it comes to GPA, the total GPA for all matriculants averages to 3.79. And when it comes to non-science, it's a 3.87 and science 3.73. Now looking at table A21, this is an official WMC table. You can access it below as well. We're looking from 2018 to 2025 MCAT scores and GPAs for applicants to USMD schools, and it's stratified by gender, men and women. So if we look at the total MCAT, the average of all male applicants 508.1, and average for all female applicants 504.6, and the average across both genders of 506.1. There were 22,000 men who applied and 29,500 women who applied. I'm honestly not surprised by that because we have noticed a trend in the last several years that there are more and more women who are really excelling in college and in graduate school. And I believe it's approximately 60% of students enrolled in university are actually women and 40% are men. So therefore, it's not surprising because you need to complete a 4-year degree to get into med school that we have more women applying than men. Now, table A22 is the same data, but now for matriculants rather than applicants. And the interesting thing here is that the men who matriculate have an average MCAT of a 512.6, again, versus the average of all applicants of 511.8, and women have a 511.1. But when you look at the section breakdowns within the MCAT, you're going to notice that when it comes to CARS and Psych Soc, men and women have the exact same averages, 126.9 for CARS and 128.9 for Psych Soc. But when you look at Chem Phys and Biochem, you'll note that men have an average Chem Phys score that is 0.8 points higher than women, and a Biochem score that is 0.7 points higher than women. Now onto the GPA. When we look at applicants, men have an average of 3.66, very, very close to the 3.65 of women. But when you look at the non-science versus science, men have a higher average on science GPA of a 3.59 versus a 3.53 for women. And on the non-science, it is inverted, where women have a higher 3.81 versus men's 3.76. So the average total GPA for men matriculants is a 3.78, which is lower than women's 3.80. And when it comes to the science GPA, they are slightly higher at a 3.74 versus women's 3.72. And again, with the non-science is inverted, where men are slightly lower at a 3.84 versus women's 3.89. And just like we had more women applying to med school versus men, we also have more women matriculating into med school versus men. So this has actually been a trend for the last, I think, a decade or longer. And that spread has actually been increasing, where more and more women are going into med school each year and fewer men in comparison. So most recently, 10,261 men and 12,749 women. I think many people who have backgrounds in medicine or neuroscience or have studied the brain and development are not going to be surprised by the fact that on a large population level, again, these are large averages, a lot of individual variation, but on these large averages, men are slightly outperforming women in terms of science, both on the MCAT and on GPA, and women are outperforming men, at least in the GPA sense, on the non-science aspect, and they're tied with men on CARS and Psych Soc, which are less of hard sciences versus Biochem and Chem Phys. And finally, table A18, we're going to go into MCAT and GPA by race and ethnicity. Now, on the right-hand side, again, you can see those averages of a 511.8 for the MCAT, 3.73 for science GPA, 3.87 for non-science GPA, and overall GPA 3.79. Now let's start with white or Caucasians, as that is the largest group. You'll see the total MCAT for white matriculants is a 512.2, slightly above the 511.8. And you'll also note that the GPA across science, non-science, and total is also slightly higher versus the overall total. Now, if we look at Black or African American, you're going to see a total MCAT of a 506.4, which is quite a bit lower than the 511.8 average, a science GPA of a 3.49, non-science GPA of a 3.76, and a total GPA of a 3.62. Now, those who are familiar with the June 2023 decision in the Supreme Court of Students for Fair Admissions, Inc. versus President and Fellows of Harvard College, the court essentially ruled that universities can't use race as a factor in admissions decisions. And while that case technically applied to undergraduate admissions, the ruling actually applies to any higher level education, and that would include medical school, graduate school admissions as well. Following the ruling, AAMC also stated that U.S. medical schools must not factor in either race or ethnicity in admissions decisions. And in this first year, this 2024 data that we're actually looking at, preliminary data from certain studies that I'm seeing are suggesting that we are seeing actually a decrease in the number of underrepresented minorities that are entering medical school. However, it's still very early on because the decision was made in the summer of 2023, and this is only one application cycle that has elapsed since, because we're now looking at the admissions data for those who started med school in the fall of 2024. So that's just 1 year later. But we are still seeing some significant differences in the data right here from the AAMC with regards to the average MCAT and GPA based on ethnic groups. And obviously, your application is much more than just your MCAT and your GPA, so keep that in mind. But obviously, you can't easily quantify and measure someone's personal statement, their working activities, their secondaries, their overall interview skills, etc. So we look at MCAT and GPA. Now, looking at Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin, the total MCAT 505.9, and GPA is also lower than the averages, so we have 3.55 for science, non-science at a 3.79, and a total at a 3.65. And if we look at American Indian or Alaskan, these actually have the lowest averages, so the total MCAT here is a 503.3, science GPA of a 3.38, non-science GPA of a 3.63, and a total GPA of a 3.49. And finally, Asian, which includes East Asian, like China, and also South Asian, like India. We have a total MCAT for matriculants of a 513.9, quite a bit higher than the 511.8, that is the average total, and also quite a bit higher than white, which is 512.2. Science GPA of a 3.79, non-science of a 3.90, and a total GPA of a 3.84 puts the Asian group as the highest MCAT and highest GPA, and every subset of the GPA as well, both science and non-science. The reason this is important is that depending on whether you are man or woman, and depending on what your actual ethnic or race is, that does influence the strategy of you applying. Now, why does this matter, and how is it actually actionable for you as a pre-med trying to get into med school? Well, when we're working with clients, especially multiple years out, and they're working on crafting their application, understanding how hard they need to work towards their MCAT, their GPA, their extracurriculars, how to balance all these things, and where to portion appropriate effort to either increase or decrease, because it's all relative, right? We have 24 hours in a day. We can't max out every single thing on our application. We have to prioritize, pick and choose. Then, depending on which group you fall into, that's going to give you a good floor, a good thing to target at minimum and to exceed. So if you are an Asian man, your targets are going to look different than if you are a Native American woman, as an example. And while this may seem like a novel idea when it comes to medical school admissions, it's actually not novel in other areas of life or in medicine at large, right? So when we look at BMI as an example, BMI is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And it's not a very high resolution metric, but it's also a lot easier than giving everyone a DEXA body scan and then looking at their subcutaneous versus their visceral body fat and so on. So it's a very rough proxy for things like metabolic disease and cardiovascular risk. So on the standard scale for BMI, the normal or healthy range is between 18.5 and 24.9. Whereas for Asians, the normal is from 18.5 to 22.9 rather than 24.9. Well, because of genetic differences, because of the different ways that Asians store body fat, tending to be more visceral versus subcutaneous versus other populations, they have a higher risk of certain cardiometabolic diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular disease versus other populations. So to account for that added risk, they have to shift what is considered normal. Because what BMI is trying to do is stratify risk. So if we look at the risk profile for, let's say, diabetes, for a Caucasian with a BMI of 25 or 26, that risk would be much higher in an Asian person with a BMI of 25 or 26, but it would be equal to an Asian person with a BMI of, let's say, 23 or 24. All right, now getting back to med school applications. So when I was having this conversation with a student recently, he is from the Asian group, and his MCAT score is in the range that we're talking about, where if he was part of a different group, I might have given him different advice as to whether he should retake or not. But because he is a male that is Asian, based on the data, it would be irresponsible of me to give him the same guidance as someone who is, let's say, a American Indian or Alaskan female, right? If I'm looking at just the numbers, I'm looking at their GPA and MCAT, and all else being equal in terms of their extracurriculars, their essay writing skills, etc., etc. Because of course, applications are not just hard metrics. But it would be very irresponsible and negligent, I would argue, to give both of those students the same advice in terms of target MCAT, target GPA, and acceptance odds with a given set of MCAT and GPA. And there you have it, my friends. So again, if you want to look at official residency data, check out specialtyrank.com. You can play around with the data, look at the match rates for MD, DO, IMG. And if you want to know your odds of getting into med school and build your own list of med schools to apply to, then check out medschoolinsiders.com/schools. Totally free tool that I hope you find helpful. Much love, my friends, and I'll see you all in that next one.